Hello, my name is Dr. Kathy J. Brown. I'm an assistant professor of art education at the University of North Texas. Welcome to the next installment of our ongoing conversation with contemporary BIPOC thought leaders and visionaries, entitled the 2044 series, Anti-Racist Praxis as Futurist Art and Design Pedagogy. Today's virtual panel features an innovative art historian and two dynamic design professionals. As we unpack the topic of visual narratives, anti-racist pedagogy and art and design. Thank you in advance to our audience, and thank you to the Onstage Institute led by Peter Hyland, UNT's College of Visual Art and Design, and our additional sponsors for their support of this emergent project. As before, this discussion will be framed by three guiding questions. Dr. Lauren Cross will introduce herself, our speakers, and provide definitions for additional context for our series.
Hi, I'm Dr. Lauren Cross, and I'm the program coordinator and assistant professor of interdisciplinary art and design studies. And I'm really excited to bring us into our new topic for the 2044 series, which is visual narratives, anti-racist pedagogy in art and design. So we will begin by overviewing and looking at some of the key terms that we'll be talking about within the series and within this conversation: Afrofuturism, critical race theory, and anti-Blackness. Some of our panelists may decide to share their screens as they present their visual content. And our episode will be framed around three guiding questions, which will be featured a little later. And this is actually a part of an ongoing conversation that we've been having this year. We're having pre-recorded episodes that will be released over the course of the year. So first, getting into some of our key terms for the series: Afrofuturism. We're coming from a version that was published by Bennett Caper, where he's looking at Afrofuturism as a way of both future-looking and backward-looking, and committing to reclaiming approaches, methodologies, and ways of thinking that predate slavery and colonization. And he says that Afrofuturism asks, what would we be without, what would we be if, and most importantly, by engaging in reclamation, by valorizing a range of cultural traditions, it offers a vision of what could be in the future. And we know, and one of the things that Dr. Brown and I, what we really investigate is the many tenets of Afrofuturism. So as you can see in this list, there are many, many ways in which Afrofuturism can be exhibited in visual art, design, music, film, technology, and many more. We also are looking at anti-Blackness and the ways in which racism is really targeting Black people and in a very specific way since the inception of chattel enslavement. And then we're also looking at the framework of critical race theory. Here we look at the specific definition outlined by Bennett Caper, where the key points are racial hierarchies are socially constructed, or hierarchies are socially constructed, interest convergence, racism is embedded in American society, and supports personal narrative or legal storytelling. We apply these frameworks of critical race theory within art, within museums and exhibitions, and in design. So our three guiding questions for today are, looking at the respective pedagogical context of our panelists. They'll be sharing the ways in which they decolonize within their curricula and practice anti-racism in their pedagogy and in their work, and ways in which they reimagine or resist classification in their work, and then their specific tenets of Afrofuturism within their own context. So the definitions that we outlined before, understanding that each designer, scholar, artist is going to have their different ways of doing that. So now I will begin by introducing our esteemed panelists for today. I'll start with Dr. Bridget Cooks, who is an associate professor in the Department of Art History and Department of African American Studies at the University of California, Irvine. Her research focuses on African American artists, Black visual culture, and museum criticism. Cooks has worked in museum education and has curated several exhibitions, including Grafton Tyler Brown, Exploring California at the Pasadena Museum of California Art, Ernie Barnes, a retrospective at the California African American Museum at CAM, and then most recently, a nationally touring exhibition called The Black Index. She is also an author of the book Exhibiting Blackness, African Americans and the American Art Museum. And some of her other publications can be found in After All, After Image, American Studies, Aperture, and American Quarterly. Help us in welcoming Bridget Cooks. Our next panelist is Omari Souza, who is an assistant professor in communication design at Texas State University. He is the organizer of the State of Black Design Conference, which was online in April 2021. And he previously organized and hosted a multi-panel event titled The State of Black Design, which was online as well in September 2020, and drew a live audience of over 2,000 attendees and was the second largest live stream audience for an academic event in Texas State's history. Omari is a first-generation American of Jamaican descent, raised in the Bronx, New York. Before arriving at Texas State, he gained work experience with companies and institutions such as Vibe Magazine, the Buffalo News, CBS Radio, and Case Western Reserve University. He earned a BFA in digital media from California, Cleveland Institute of Art, and an MFA in design from Kent State University. Omari's research explores the idea of perceptions and how visual narratives influence culture, how we view ourselves and others around us. Help us in welcoming Omari Souza. Our next esteemed panelist is Wesley Taylor, who is an assistant professor in the Art Foundation program and a professor of graphic design at Virginia Commonwealth University. He is a fine artist, musician, and curator, as well as a co-founding partner of Emergence Media, a network of artistic producers based in Detroit, Michigan. He manages a 5-person artists studio collective in Detroit called Talking Dolls, and has spent many years scene building in that city's hip hop community as both an MC and graphic designer. Taylor previously taught at Lawrence Technical University, Wayne State University, and Eastern Michigan University. He earned his MFA in 2D design from Cranebrook Academy of Art and his BFA in art and design from the University of Michigan. We're so very excited to welcome our wonderful esteemed guests. And I will conclude there so we can begin our discussion.
Okay, I'll begin with our first question for the panel. This question derives from Professor Souza's State of Black Design Conference. In your retrospective pedagogical context, or the field in general, how is hegemony perpetuated? And how are you as professors decolonizing your curriculum and practicing anti-racist pedagogy?
Well, first, I'd like to say thank you for having me. It's an amazing opportunity to speak on a panel with you guys, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion we have today. To answer your question, I think pedagogy is perpetuated by canons or methodologies that are created by a dominant party without regard for the marginalized groups. In my own personal work, I attempt to disrupt perpetuating I attempt to disrupt hegemony by actually offering alternatives beyond the normal canon that's provided. For example, traditional speculative design courses that are offered at design institutions usually do not come with prior requirements to make yourself aware of or understanding communities outside of yourself. So students that begin to design products, services, or campaigns that may involve minorities or people of different sexual orientations or genders, are being done without any understanding of who they are. So for me, as a professor, I typically begin these classes rather than delivering the course material through a creative brief and starting with source material that already introduces them to groups outside of themselves. So for example, a class that I've written uses the work of Octavia Butler, who's a speculative fiction writer, as the basis for which we begin the discussion of speculative design arguments. We use the world that she establishes in different pieces of literature to assist in conversations about people of color, people of different sexual orientations, non-gender, binary conforming identities and things of that nature. But through reading material that introduces you to some of the problems and nuances that people experience in these categories, it disrupts what's been perpetuated prior, and gives those students a little bit more of an expansive understanding of the people that they may be designing for.
I'll jump in if that's okay. I just wanted to, thank you for having me be a part of this. And I wanted to speak about the question, thinking about both art history as a field and also museums and museum studies as a field. So, we've been struggling for a while in the academy with the exclusion of Black artists, and particularly in American art, where to put Black American artists. And so there have been some studies. There was one in the 90s by Kim Pender, who's now dean of the art school at Yale, where she was looking at just the survey texts that you get in these big art history classes, and looking at the absence of Black people in those stories. Also looking at how practically, in practice, there'll be a chapter on Africa, and then usually the professor skips over that chapter. So we're talking about histories of exclusion that are willful, and I think based in a tradition of ignorance, right? Because many of the professors that I had were not qualified to teach that material, but they also didn't feel compelled to learn it, to be able to make it part of pedagogy. So part of what I try to do in my classes that focus on Black artists is to make sure that we're reading the scholarship of Black writers, as well as looking at the work of Black artists. I assume no knowledge from my students on, can you name a Black artist? And it's, they usually turn to hip hop, and it's like, okay, a visual artist, and then it's like, we got to really start to define terms. So, and I also do try to teach the work, particularly of white scholars who serve as allies, who have done their research to be able to speak with some certainty about the relevance of Black artists in art history. And sometimes, and this is kind of unfortunate, the students really are skeptical, when it's Professor Cook saying these things, because I'm Black and I'm talking about Black people, and so I'm saying these wonderful things. But when I have a white author saying it's, for some students, that gives me and the value of what I'm saying credibility. So I used to resent that. Now I just roll with it. It's important for the students to just get the information. For me personally, it's important to bring in a Black feminist perspective in what I'm teaching. I'm really clear about what my values are, and criticize racism, anti-Blackness in particular, and sexism. Those two things are not separate for me. And just a little bit more. I would say in terms of pedagogy, it's important for me to work in the classroom, but then also to take my students out of the classroom to see exhibitions of Black artists. We can see work in context, how we might think of work or interpret it differently if it's at LACMA versus the California African American Museum, right? Like how do those contexts perhaps inform the way that we see and understand work? And then also curating shows is another way to sort of practice what you preach. And in two levels, I say, in one way, it's practicing what I preach in the academy, working with students, but it's also a way for me to work with museums and galleries to try to help them reach audiences that I can't just through teaching. So I try to work with different platforms, different people, different contexts, because we're in an all hands on deck situation. Right? Where all of us here on the screen are coming from different but related fields. But then we're also like through podcasts, through videos, through films, through, text, literary text. Those are all needed to try to permeate the culture.
Just jumping in. So, I mean, third, respecting the alphabetical order, I feel like that was put in the plan. So Taylor is usually comes later. But I think about this inside and outside of academia in some of my work. And knowing that my life as an artist preceded academia and probably my life as an artist will last long after academia, like, inshallah, really I'm working towards that. And I guess being 10 years in academia, I'm running into roadblocks and seeing that probably this question is not going to be answered in these institutions or the way that I'm seeing it. And so early on, I think developing my awareness of the arts and art history and this idea of canons and things like that, I had this skepticism of this idea of modernism, and I didn't know what it was. And then it became a target after I started to understand what the tenets were. And so at a time, I was just thinking about hegemony through preference, through taste, through curation, through, really through a lot of hype, right? Through the Clement Greenbergs of the world or these other art historians who really just put people on pedestals because they had the opportunity to just put a person on a pedestal for whatever reason. And so, I used to really reverse engineer how artists became part of a canon or became the thing, right? And so I gained an appreciation for certain artists, but I realized we can cuss on this, right? Or no? I won't. Teachers, so I won't even do that. I'll catch myself. I was like, Kathy throwing out the hip hop terminology. I'll throw that out there, but
I think so.
It's all good. I can censor myself in that way. But I used to think, I realized a lot of it was bull, right? But the appreciation of the people that actually gamed the system was also something I discovered. So Marcel Duchamp, where I was like, that person is a trickster and is gaming the system as a white man, but I also understood how bull all of this was. And so in thinking about that and then applying that to modernism within design, I realized there's a lot of reverence that goes to people. But also the rule writers are a lot of times cisgendered, heterosexual white men, and they're writing the rules at any time they see convenient, or at any point in time they think it's the right time to write the rules to keep them on top. And so through like different manifestos and things like that, right? That go into our fields as like law. And so I've also like really got into this idea of like writing manifestos as if that's the thing that pushes things forward, then I'm going to do that. And then it's like, well, who are the rule writers? And without like dragging this all the way back to history, I'm just like, the articles and the foundation of this country were like written by the same people that in a lot of ways demographically are the people that write the rules that govern the arts. And the approach is the same and the results are a lot of times the same. And so I'm like, well, I'm in the arts, I'm not in the US government. I can write new rules too, or I can encourage marginalized people to write rules and come together and think about that. So an example is a thing that I was part of helping facilitate, which is now the Design Justice Network, which originally it was a reason to redefine the principles and what are valued in design. And it was also like a conversation that was an extension of like neoliberalism in design that I thought always fell short in its effectiveness of trying to address like the world's problems, or especially this country's problems. So, and that was once again, like the neoliberal approach was still white people writing these rules. And I'm just, so I think that's one way. But going back to, I feel like Omari and Dr. Cook's, making sure I don't do this all the time, but picking and choosing my times where Kimberly Crenshaw is mentioned and studied and we go into it. We have a conversation, whether we're starting with, Octavia E. Butler or ending with Octavia E. Butler, like that has to be thrown in the mix. And then also like, I'm like inside and outside, I'm always trying to figure out like, Black contributions to culture are not inside of academia. And also like this idea of like, when you want to like speak to hip hop, right, which is a major contribution to world culture. I never had an experience in the school where these things were being taught, or if I could teach that stuff or like learn those things. But also I realized like when those things get absorbed by academia, you have to be extreme examples of Black excellence to teach that. So it's not like I could be Wes Taylor and teach hip hop. It actually has to be Nas at Harvard teaching hip hop. And that's the only way that it's really like part of this. So I'm trying to like always like push against these and like question why it even happens in that way.
I'm muted, so you don't hear me over here just like, yes, yes to everything you all are saying. So just as a follow-up question, some of the things that I'm hearing from all of you is just really how necessary it is to find alternatives or new approaches when you're trying to challenge these, challenge hegemony, dismantle, as Omari used that term, challenge how the system, the academy, our various different fields are functioning. It seems that it's imperative that we all add something, not as add and stir, but adding that is like contributing, something significant. So do you all want to kind of speak more to that part of like maybe when you realized that like, okay, if I'm going to be able to make a contribution to this, I'm going to have to do X, Y, and Z, or I'm going to have to do, Bridget, you talked about incorporating all these different modes of creativity too. Like, I think there's like a point, I feel like when you realize that in order for me to be successful, like I'm going to have to do ...
Yeah, I'll since you called my name, I'm happy to speak to this because I've been thinking about this a lot. A friend who's an artist told me recently, don't let the university set the bar for you. And I was so kind of shook by that, because the university, my university has a high bar. And when you finally get the job, right, assistant professor, and then it's like tenure, now how do I do that, and you don't have any leverage, and you can't offend anybody, you don't know who you might offend, and and you navigate all of that, and then you reach that and then surpass that, and then there's always another hoop, another bar. And I would say part of what I'm trying to do in terms of even defining what success is, it really is beyond what the university says is success. So we're working within an institution that has one definition, but then I think we as Black creatives, intellectuals, educators, right, we have a higher standard and a different audience. Right. So success in those terms of the academy might be, in a way, it sounds strange because it's a high bar, but it can also be limiting, right? Because who they value and who you value does not always overlap. So I would say mentorship has been so important in my life, particularly by Black women, but not exclusively, who have done things that I didn't think were possible. And, you try to follow in their footsteps or whatever that looks like for you, but you also have to do something that is more conceptual, which is, it's not about just doing the task that they did. It's about going through the thought process that they did of what can I do that's different, that's going to push, that's going to be innovative. So I think my mentors in art history and other fields, but then also creative people, because we have to have creatives to have the vision to see how we get to another place. And so I think with Afrofuturism, we all agree how important that is. But even on the level of one's career, to imagine, if you have the bar the university sets for you, but what's your bar, right? Like someone asked me, what is the biggest thing, your kind of ultimate goal that you want to reach? And let's do that. And I was taken aback again. I was like, well, give me a minute on that, because I'm big on lists. I got things, I check them off every day. It makes me feel good. I got this done, even eating lunch. I did eat lunch, put that on the list, taking care of myself. But then to really step back and say, let's look at the big picture. That's when the artists, for me personally, they're so generous with their gifts and just their conversation to help me kind of make my life in art practice, right? And create new shapes. So those are my thoughts about those challenges.
Well, I agree with everything that Dr. Cook just mentioned in terms of process and journey and trying not to allow academia to set your limit or define who you are. I think in a lot of ways, being a Black academic is kind of what triggers you to do more to an extent, because you are the unicorn while there. And the responsibilities that you have, not just to yourself, but to your students, are a little bit different than some of your colleagues. For example, being the only Black professor that's on a tenure line in my department, I get a lot of students that are of color and are different sexual orientations that'll come to me, because to them, I'm one of the few options that don't fall within, pretty much I'm one of the few options that isn't a cis white male. So for them, they'll come to me and talk about things they may not talk with other colleagues about. I think as a person of color who then also gets pulled on, diversity and inclusion committees and all of these other things, their responsibilities that I have to the people that they're attempting to attract in. If it becomes a space that isn't equitable for them, then I'm not doing my job as a professor. So I do have to give some pushback, and I do have to, while coming to that realization, develop thicker skin, because you realize that, if a university is a perpetuator of the very thing that you're attempting to speak against, that your existence and your work by proxy ruffles feathers. And as a professor, I don't necessarily do things intentionally to ruffle feathers, but being different from the status quo is what creates a level of discomfort for folks that are attempting to keep things the way that they are.
Did you have something to add, Wes? Thank you, Omari. That hit right on the money in so many ways. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big question, just about success, and then, even coming to terms with my students, like defining this idea and constantly like redefining this idea of what success is, and doing having exercises. And I actually think that work is sometimes more important than just instilling skills. If we're just talking about what do you value? What do you know why you value some of these things as success? And so I don't know, that's really important. But I think even within academia, recognizing that a lot of my biggest contributions to academia have been developed outside of academia and not through academia support. And so, and it's crazy seeing how it flips back into these conversations. And so I brought up Design Justice Network, which was not developed through an institution or anything. It was a ground up. It's a network that involves a lot of people within academia right now, but was a lot of people fed up with their current positions and figuring that out. But now it's interesting because there are universities doing group hires that are specifically using the language that we drafted 6 years ago in order to describe position. And so that's really interesting. And then other work that I've been involved with, such as Emergent Strategy, which is the book written by Adrienne Marie Brown. My collective, we did the research on emergent strategy and worked with Adrienne on that. And so now people are the book is circulating crazy within academic circles, and that had nothing to do with academia. That was actually borrowing the context and the radical thoughts and the visionary work of our elders in our communities. And so bringing those things to the forefront and not thinking about validation, validation from a university had nothing to do with bringing up Grace Lee Boggs and Jimmy Boggs' work to the forefront. And so some of the other work that we're doing with other elders in our community with their scholarship and bringing that to the forefront, and still not thinking about because some of that work has already been shunned, forgotten, erased by their institutions. And then having younger generations unearth that and re-bring those things back to the forefront where it was shunned because it was too ahead of its time, or too radical at the time. Now people are actually ready for some things that were written in the 70s, the 80s, that are predicting these moments. And so I think about success, being the successes of the work that has already come before and just never got its shine.
If I can ask a quick follow-up question before we go to question 2, which was a brilliant idea by Wes to put in the chat. So it's in the chat too, so you can read it as well as when I read it. My question goes back to something that Dr. Cook said earlier when you were speaking about the difference in how works are presented in Black museums or Black spaces as opposed to, I'm just going to say PWI museums. I don't know if that's the correct term, but what have you seen as a difference? I think of myself as a teacher taking students to a museum, and if I'm taking students to a predominantly white museum or a historically Black museum, what are the differences of how the work is going to be presented?
It's a big picture in terms of even just the neighborhood, you know, like getting to the museum, looking at the community, your procession to the space, how you're greeted when you get there, you know, who maybe the guards are, if there are guards, you know, it's a different feeling often to go. And sometimes the wall text might be a little bit different. So I would say it makes them aware of different contexts, different people who are invested in the material. So going to the California African American Museum to see work versus going to the Broad Museum, which is a much more spectacular structure, and parking is really expensive and it's really crowded. And then they'll have, you know, work by mostly white artists and then Black artists in different sections. And it also shows the artwork in different contexts in terms of artistic context. Is the theme of the work, let's say, about portraiture and science fiction that you might see at the African American Museum, is that the same theme that you see when you go to the Broad or when you go to LACMA? Or, you know, is it a more formal kind of evaluation of the work to connect it to art history? Or is it really focusing on issues of Black survival? And I'm not saying it's always one way or always another way, but all of those things affect the work and the way that you perceive the work. I'd say that there's also sometimes there's crossover, but sometimes they're not. The kind of art that you see that's considered a value in Black museums is not the kind of art that's you see at the Broad, perhaps by successful Black artists. And so just the students need to take notice of that, like what is able to cross over and why is this considered acceptable in, you know, a white space, or not acceptable in a white space, but acceptable in, you know, those kinds of things I think impact our understanding of the art. And in another way, the challenges that face Black artists. What do you have to do to cross over? And is that something you want to do? You know, what's the price of the ticket, essentially?
Thank you all for your brilliant answers. I'm going to move on to question 2, which again is in the chat, but I'll read it as well. You all are feeding my soul right now, you know. All right, so you guys, question 2. All right, so Dr. Cooks states in her description of the Black Index that it aims to challenge the desire for classification. Both Lauren and myself created this series in part to expand the definitions of both anti-racist pedagogy and Afrofuturism, which are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Moreover, Professor Taylor works collaboratively with varied arts collectives, which you spoke a little bit about earlier. One of which is entitled The Complex Movements, which explores the connections of complex science and social justice movements. How do you all as a panel, how does your work reimagine and or resist classification?
I just want to give you a brief example of challenging classification. So I am going to show a couple of images here. This is an example of work by Titus Kaphar. All of these things are. He's someone who is an artist who is really interested in redressing history through remaking and interrogating history paintings. And I'm showing some examples of his work that's been circulated well, like in Time magazine. Let's see if there, yeah, and he was on the, a detail of one of his paintings was on the cover of Time magazine last year, responding to Black mothers losing their children because of anti-Black violence. But there's some works by him in the exhibition that I just will talk about very briefly. One is from the Asphalt and Chalk series, which is part of his project called the Jerome Project, in which he was taking images of Black men, all incarcerated, who all share the same first and last name of his father, Jerome, who has also been in and out of prison for much of his adult life. And he represents them in triplicate so that it's difficult to parse out one identity from the other. And there's a way in which this work mirrors or references, really by practice, what happens to the Black identity of individuals once they enter the system, and how hard it is to disentangle the individual when they become a number or a statistic. And so that's part of what he's showing here in these overlapping identities. So this is a way to kind of show classification by me making a mugshot, but then also criticizing it at the same time and seeing what's lost. This is another example from that series. And then, and some of them are not Jerome. Some of them are people who now in their death have become household names. I mean, this is Titus Kafar's work, but it's also has become part of my practice as a scholar because I do teach his work. I have included it in the Black Index as a way for people to see how we are as Black people aware that we're reduced, that we're distilled into these essentialized categories, and that we fight against those things, that we are inherently as people in excess of all of the definitions of Blackness that limit who we are.
I was just going to speak to like the second part of like complex movements and like classification, but then also like an anecdote real quick, like in my classroom where we were just dealing with like information and display of information, and really trying to create like models and simulations and I don't know, extracting information and displaying it graphically and aestheticizing it. And so we had this conversation about classification and taxonomy. And so before we even got into it, like we read some stuff, watched some videos about like the history of like taxonomy, even in biology, and then thinking about like how classification works, and then going to like the origins of like even those practices. And so on one end, we learn about this person called Carl Linnaeus, who is the godfather of classification and taxonomy as we know it now in like our, modern like systems of science, who inspired like Charles Darwin. And so, we talk about how we get like genuses and like these other things, and how we classify, plants and animals. And then also introducing my students, which are in this instance, almost all white class, but also his classification, like going over media of his classification of the races, and understanding that at the time of classification, and the same person where we understand how we organize animals in the natural world was also the origins of how we like codified our system of races, and like, the study of science that we think of in a lot of ways is unquestioned, and realizing that even when he did that, classify like these races, he had only known European people when he made these descriptions, and only read about other people when, so we take that, like the way we organize the natural world is from this guy, right? Who was using racist stereotypes and tropes in his research to classify people and projecting that. And I think the thing is like, that is like kind of our law, you know what I mean? Like in some ways, like I don't figure out better ways to articulate it. But then like in my practice with complex movements, it's really interesting because I feel like my job is done when we confound curators. And like curators are like, no, we have to restructure our whole like way to do this to present your work. And this happens like more often than not where, because it's like if we present the work, then we'll have to work with like, you know, our performance people, but then like it's gonna have to go into this space. And what's crazy is like those people don't talk. And it's like more often than not, like you see in these silos in these institutions, like even jamming the system where we're making interdisciplinary work, multimedia-based work. We're making like anti-disciplinary work that goes like deals with architecture. It deals with performance. It deals with like hip hop. It deals with science fiction. It deals with speculative fiction. It combines all of these disciplines. And then museums are like, we don't know, like we're interested. That's why we have the meeting and like, we don't know what to do with this. And I'm like, all right, we're doing our job when that happens. So I feel like just uprooting those things and being like, you know, and like having serious conversation with serious institutions were like, this can't happen because like we're not restructuring until like another 6 years. So then we can talk. So those are fun conversations.
Building on what Dr. Cook and Wes just mentioned, I think the work that I do addresses classifications in two separate ways. In one way, things that I do, such as the events that I host and State of Black Design, is intended to work despite of classifications. And what I mean by that is working in a space where people of color are able to be their free and authentic selves without concerns of what the outside world may classify them as. This becomes a disruption to classifications because we're not playing a role that people feel that we should be in. I can't tell you some of the letters that I've received by people who've been upset by the fact that there was an event for Black designers or for Black creatives, because there is this idea or understanding that, you know, we should not have these things specifically for us. And a disregard for the fact that there are a lot of things that keep us isolated from that. I think in other ways, the work that I do, whether it's the papers that I write or the classes that I teach or conferences that I present at, I'm usually attempting to, in a lot of ways, change perspectives or ideas on how things are done. So, for example, Wes spoke prior about doing manifestos. I had a class that I taught called Issues and Criticisms, Design Issues and Criticisms, where we talked about how art movements and manifestos are created. And we talked about this idea of how a lot of art movements are really established by a set group that comes up with an idea, perfects this idea based off of their own perception of what that perfect means, and then distribute it to a wide audience for consumption. And in that class, I challenged students to consider, should this be something that's the responsibility of an artist to create on their own, or should it be something that's built from the bottom up? And then we had an installation. We asked regular attendees of the building that we teach in, what do you feel the responsibility of a maker should be to those who are on the receiving end of things that are made? I think that within itself is a project that disrupts this idea of hierarchy and how information is distributed from the top down or bottom up. Regarding other classifications. Continuing the conversation on classifications and why it's harmful for students, I talk to them consistently about studies that showcase things that are designed and put out into the market, not necessarily considering people of color or placing them in particular classifications and how harmful that would be, whether it's, photo archives that if you type in Black people, gorilla pops up, or automated hand washing systems that don't recognize Black skin and things of that nature, things that aren't tested utilizing Black people because we aren't necessarily considered I guess important or priority in those types of setting situations. And it's funny for me, this is going to be a graphic analogy, but I feel like it works. In a lot of my discussions with colleagues or people in general that may challenge the approach that I take, a lot of times there is this feeling that the rehashing history or re-exploring difficult subject matter isn't necessarily important. What is important is simply getting students and education out the door, when in reality, systemic oppression is similar to a language, and that, it begins by an exchange, an agreed upon exchange of a group of people. And that language evolves over time. So it may not be spoken the same way. There may be nuances and colloquialisms that are provided within that language. But if you don't do things to disrupt words that are being utilized or ways that this language, harmful ways that this language can be used, you kind of end up continuing the same harmful processes that you've been doing before. So in one conversation in particular, I remember a colleague challenging me and saying, at what point does progress become enough? When should people of color be happy with the changes and the progress that's been made? And the response that I gave them was, if I place a cup in front of you and I pee in the cup, and I ask you to drink from it, how many glasses of water will I have to pour into the cup before you feel like it's safe to drink from? And it's, I use that illustration to kind of just say to him, while this is an extremely gross metaphor, the conditions that people of color and women and people who are non-gender conforming live in today are very harmful and in many ways gross situations. And a lot of times when you're telling me that I don't need to push things any further, you're simply saying that, you should still drink from the cup, even though this cup hasn't been washed, it hasn't been cleaned. I've simply just poured water over the top, and you should be happy with the progress that, this is slightly cleaner than it was beforehand. To wrap up, I guess my point, it was a very long-winded response, but those are the ways in which I try to push back against classifications.
I think that's I think that was a very helpful description of the experience, right? Of trying to quantify and classify like what a really uncomfortable, or what some say a shitty experience is, right? If it's bad, it's bad, right? And no amount of, what people may consider as improvement, it doesn't address oftentimes the mistreatment that happened before, right? It doesn't acknowledge it really. And so I think that the mistreatment has to be acknowledged first in order for, I hate to say healing, to occur, but I do feel like there's a lot of pain, right? There's a lot of issues that are just at the baseline, and then when you start to say, oh, what can we do to help? It's like, yeah, all those things are nice, but at the baseline, we need to address that part, and why we are even in this position in the first place. So I love all of what you all are saying, because it's such an important aspect. And a lot of times in conversations with students that I have, they are concerned about these things. Those kind of side conversations that may not be the conversations of the day or, what the lecture is about, but those conversations where you get pulled to the side or you get that email from a graduate student or, as Omari, you talked about earlier, just kind of being that faculty member that students tend to go to because you're different and they know that your difference, they identify with that difference in whatever that might be. And they know that you understand that baseline pain in which they're dealing with. And so I think one kind of follow-up that I have is like, as teachers or, not even just teachers, but like, how do we encourage those creatives in the world to continue to think through how to continue to be, right?
Yeah.
In a world that is painful and doesn't always understand what we need, right? So, and that's, I get asked that question all the time by my students, like, how do you do this? Like, cause they're just as students, they're watching and they're like, I don't know how I'm gonna do this. And they're seeing us working and it seems impossible. Like, how do you do that? How do you keep working and it's painful? So, and to understand that to defy classification and to do the work of defying classification means that you're taking on more and more pain oftentimes just to do the work. So I always give my students my response, but I'm sure there are people watching that are like, man, they're looking at what you've done, Omari, what you've done, Dr. Cooks, and what you've done, Wes, and they're like, man, like, how do you keep going and keep kicking? Right? Understanding that you may not necessarily get that fresh cup, Omari, like you said, you may not ever get that, right? So how do you just keep pushing?
Well, I'm a dad. I have two little boys. And one thing my mom used to always say to me is, wherever you go, you want to leave it in a better condition than it was before you got there. So even if I never get that fresh cup, but that cup is slightly fresher for my sons, or if it's fresher than it's ever been for me, for them, that's something that motivates me. I think also for myself, if I find comfort in not fighting anymore, to me internally, that registers as, maybe I'm telling myself I deserve this. So it's painful, but, if I feel that I deserve more or deserve, human dignity, that's allotted to some of my non-POC colleagues, I can't particularly give up, or I'm saying that this is good enough for me, and it's not. There's progress I have to make, not just for myself, but for others that look like me and others that are attempting to occupy similar spaces. Not to quote J. Cole, but what's the purpose of flying first class if none of your friends can't fly with you? So it's one of those situations.
Yes, I just echo all of that. Collaboration is so important. It's hard to explain, but I think people will find that this resonates, especially during, we're still in COVID, but in the worst that we've seen. Wow, it was so helpful to work with artists and to check in with people and to know that you are accountable to them. And just to check in and, see how the work is going, but also just to talk about how you're doing. It was like other people just saying, well, here's really what, because people will say, how are you? And you either say fine, or you get a bottle of wine and sit down. Right. So it's like, I'll tell you, like, do you really want to know today? It's like, yes, and so that kind of thing was so critical. And you want to fly first class, but my philosophy for working with people is everybody gets paid. There's no free Black labor. If I get money from the Ford, you get money from the Ford, right? Like, we have to be accountable and responsible to each other. And it is about, again, having that vision of what can we do together? How can I, as a curator, my job is to find talented people. It's like, well, how can I elevate your work? And I mean that in the best sense of the word, not in terms of a hierarchy, but elevate it in terms of like helps share it is what I mean. Like, that gives me joy. And so that collaboration is really key and helps you to keep going. Self-care, mental health issues, those are real things. And you really have to have a sense of balance. But I think feeling like you're part of a network, I work better on my own. I need peace to work, but I want to make sounds with other people, and I have to figure out how to do that. And that, that's. And I will say this last thing. I know I can go on. I have always had Black class after class. Everybody leaves but the Black students, and they wait. They wait for me to pack up my stuff. We walk out of the room, we walk out of the building, and then we have the other class. Here's what I wanted to say, and I want to say it now. And that's just part of my job.
I wanted to say, I posted the question so you guys can see it, but before we get to that, I wanted to go back to Omari's, and I guess we officially can cuss now, Wes, because my girl Lauren and my boy Wes and my boy Omari, he didn't actually cuss me, said P, which is fine, But to go back to your analogy of P in the cup, I thought that was, brilliant. But when you talked about language, so it brought me back to, I know we probably all, this is a classic text, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire. But, he talks about kind of how like language is a part of how you oppress people, instead of using the idiom of the people, you're using the dominant syntax and all of those things. But I thought about that, and he also talks about witnessing and how you can kill the person, but you can't kill his witness, which is what leaves behind. So I think that was kind of what you were saying. What I was getting out of what you were saying was that even if, like you said, if it didn't happen for you, it would maybe be for your son's generation. But hopefully it's now. Hopefully the time is now. But and then I thought about that linked to Wes's idea of manifesto, which is also language, And then I thought how and the ideas of how it happens outside of the canon, or it happens outside of your context if you're not necessarily in academia. And so how does that kind of thread? There's a woman named Queen Quet, who's her role is she's a high priestess of the Gullah Geechee Nation in Sea Island, South Carolina, if you guys are familiar with, Gullah Geechee. But she talks about sort of like Africana cosmology and how we're threaded through time. And this may be going into dimensions, which is also part of Freire, but we're getting into Afrofuturism. So, but she talks about how like the past of who we were in the past is threaded into who we are in the future, the present and threaded into the future. So I think that all these conversations, everything that you're saying is sort of present things, but our future forward thinking at the same time, because that's what a manifesto is. A manifesto is what's going to happen, and then that's the idea of the cup is sort of, you shouldn't ever be satisfied. When one person is oppressed, we're all oppressed. And if we are the objects, how it's like the subject and the object in Freire, but if we're the objects, when do we finally see ourselves as subjects? So I just think that the P in I just think is powerful. And I think the idea of manifestos, and Bridget, I love the idea of, I think most of us kind of work on our own, but I think collaborating too, and having a system or a grouping of people who understand how we're all nodding our head through this whole conversation, because we all have had similar experiences, and we're all in totally different contexts, teaching different things, but we're all like, yeah. So I just, for those people who watch this in the future, whoever they are, I hope that they can draw the links that we're making here today too. But I just wanted to say that I thought it was brills. But so I'll go ahead and ask question 3. Let's see. All right. So how does Capers, which is the Bennett Caper's article that, of course, Lauren referenced earlier, which we framed our series around, Policing Afrofuturism in the Year 2044 is the article. But in his article, the broad tenets he proposes for Afrofuturism, which are dismantling hierarchies, alienation, reclamation, redemption, and representation. How do those things reflect in your work? And so that can be, and some of the things you kind of already touched on, but how does it reflect in your work? It can be the literal, it can be metaphorical, or it can be as palimpsests, which is a hard word to say, but I love it. So, or, and of course, palimpsests, of course, can be a metaphor as well. So you guys can go in alphabetical order again, or you can just, whoever wants to speak up first.
One project that I'm currently working on right now, it's a part of the speculative design class that I'm doing, but it's also something that I'll be presenting at a couple of conferences going forward, is this idea of the Afro-lunar aesthetic. And what this project does is it's me speculating what a Black experience or Black aesthetic will look like once we start living on the moon. And the reason this became something of interest to me was because of the current billionaire moon race ideas that were very big in the news a couple of years ago and have been big in the news again since commercial space flight now seems to be an industry that's moving forward. But the idea, in addition to that, I was exploring Hank Willis Thomas's series called Absolute Power, where he looked at rum bottles and emphasized the history of slavery with rum bottles. Not rum bottles specifically, but the creation of rum and slaves that actually processed sugar on Caribbean plantations. And the idea of space and the Middle Passage and this disconnection from continental Africa was really heavy on my heart at the time period, because the idea became, as descendants of slavery, aspects of our identity are lost. How do we rectify? We struggle and live within Western society rectifying that loss, not being fully American, but also not being fully African at the same time. So there's this weird in between. But then asking the idea of how do we then go from being these in-betweeners to not only being separated from, continental Africa, but being separated from Earth as a whole, being people that were colonized and were forced to perform labor as products, now being used as people that will colonize, another celestial body, the moon. Once we're there, how do we deal with this idea of being Black, and even more so, how do we deal with this idea of being human, especially as the idea of children and procreating on the moon becomes prevalent? We're no longer on the moon, and we're no longer on the Earth, we're on the moon. So how do we argue we are Black and we are human? How do we emphasize that or showcase that through forms of expression? Other designers like architect and Professor Sekou Cook produced a paper about the oppressive grid, where he talked about the similarities in fencing and window bars that are placed in urban communities in New York City, public schools and prison systems. And I took that and started playing with the idea of the grid structure in graphic design, which kind of, help contains and organizes copy and other assets that we may be laying out. But being as though, grids have also been used, whether it's prison bars or other forms of containment, to contain and restrict people of color, whether, you're talking about redlining and all of these other things. So for me, again, now thinking about what space looks like for us once on the moon, do we adopt similar grid structures, or do we try to find other ways to communicate visually? So for me, going back to the initial question of, how do I adhere to some of the tenets in the article? For me, it's the work that I do really uses a a lot of speculation and metaphor to get people to not only think about the now, but to think about how do we, if I go back to the analogy of pee in a cup, not just thinking about the waste that's already there, but thinking about the complexity of issues that will arise within that cup over time. And how do we begin to either work towards solutions for that in the future, or how do we begin to rectify or cope with some of those problems between now and then?
I think there's like so many thoughts that I have when this thinking about Afrofuturism, but also like the conversation about categories and thinking about how and where I even identify with this idea of Afrofuturism or these other concepts that are floating out there. I'm like, once again, it's just like, how and where did this concept come from? Even though I know it's relatively more, contemporary as a thought and idea, but did somebody as melanated as me write that concept down first? And so that's the thought that I always have. And if not, then I don't know if I can fully take that on as a concept. But also thinking about like parallel, like philosophical standpoints and like just like ideas of like even like Black pessimism. And I'm always trying to like negotiate with those concepts as well. And when I'm trying to situate what I'm thinking about, and not trying to be, sometimes I fixate and obsess on the future. And a lot of times I'm thinking about like, what's at stake? And for me, sometimes I'm like, we about to get left. And I'm like, and I'm like, they're working like, and so for me, it's just like, are we about to get left, or is there something radical that could happen where we could like beat them at their own game? And I'm like always going in between that. And like, when is that like event horizon of space colonization? Has it already happened? Are we products of that? You know what I mean? Even thinking of that. But then it's like, does space exploration happen before like artificial intelligence like makes that possible? And so it's like, what capsule, what vessel does an ascension or moving past this? And then it's just like, where is Black consciousness in that? And how do we like either beat them to it? Do we sneak it in there, inject it? Do we hide it for it to like flourish in another way? Like, and also just thinking about like whose science fiction we're living in right now. And so, we are living in like, to me, I'm always thinking about like, we're living in the four founders of this country's fiction in a lot of ways. Also thinking about like, we are our manifestations of like our wildest like ancestors' dreams, right? Also like having to negotiate that, but then also realizing we're living in, George Lucas's world right now. And so like, we have Elon Musk of this world, we have the Jeff Bezoses of this world, like fulfilling those prophecies of, Stanley Kubrick, George Lucas, and really not even questioning and understanding like how our future is always mediated. And the template always comes through movies and books. And knowing that like movies, books, documents, right? Like a lot of times we're just walking into these futures and we can just like think about like the technologies that we have. And then I always go back to the practice of like urban design and architecture, which I think is one of the most powerful expressions of futurist thinking, right? And mediated thinking where, if you're thinking about developing a city and you're thinking about 50 years out where there's a neighborhood there, then there's a neighborhood not there, then there's a brand new neighborhood there. Understanding that was planned 50 years before, 30 years before, and it was all mediated through diagrams, through renderings, through proposals to cities. And so, from a photo of a white lady walking her baby carriage through an area of a city that is mostly Black, right, and impoverished at the same time, that's science fiction that created that condition of gentrification and things like that. So, I always lean on like Octavia Butler as like, man, I hope her vision was powerful enough, but then also thinking about instilling those tools as being really important in my pedagogy is like hope and really thinking that through. Because it's like powerful vision and powerful science fiction. The tools of science fiction, I feel like, are really the most powerful tools that you can have in being creative in a lot of different ways. So I don't know, like, I get discouraged, and like going back to like what keeps me going is just like, well, the other thing that like, going back to success and like what I'm like really vying for at this moment is like, we didn't, but somebody trusted a room full of like white people to like form this country, right? I just keep going back to this country as a design project, but like I just use that as my template. But it's like, when will, and believe me when I'm saying like, this is not pandering, like this is a genuine thought that I have all the time. Like, when will we trust like a room full of like Black women to like set and state like a new nation or a new idea or do a page one rewrite of our Constitution, and like how much better like the world would be in that instant, and really, but also like the chasm of like that being such a science fiction notion, right? And like, how do we even close that gap? That doesn't even feel so far fetched. So yeah, I mean, I'll stop there.
Man, that futurist vision you just described, my brain is trying to wrap my head around that, just the radicalness of that, and just the realness of that truth that you're speaking. We all have witnessed in our own ways the distrust, the ways in which our very movements in the world are always questioned, and just, yeah, man, I'm like, it's like, wow, like that is a moment, right? I think that that's something that we all, I feel like that's practical, like completely practical. But then there's a lot of not, I don't know if it's fear, but I feel like, oh my God, but what's going to happen next? Right. So I understand what you're saying, Wes, and that, you're in that state of hope. And then you also just have these experiences, Omari, the pea in the cup, that make you feel like you're constantly grappling in between, right? Of hope and, but what's going to happen after that, knowing just how, for some people, the very thought of, a whole room of Black women making decisions and calling the shots, so to speak, is so radical of a thought, it doesn't, in some ways it's been done, right? Like, how many of you have seen a room full of Black women calling some shots, whether it's like your family?
That's right.
It's like real life for me. Like, it's so easy to see, and it's beautiful. It's like, can be some of the most beautiful moments of your life, and to know that people can totally miss it, like just miss how powerful and beautiful that is. Like a scene, thinking of visually of Daughters of the Dust. It's like one of my favorite films of all time. And people often, like, when they watch that film, they're always just like, what in the hell was that? And I feel like, it's so futurist, in a way, to imagine a world. I mean, that was an actual world that existed. But in our current time, it's like, it doesn't even seem real. Isn't that something? I always just get so mystified by, like, I love to watch people watch it and how they're just like,
Caper touches on that, Lauren. He touches on that in his piece. Wes, like he was talking about the vision of the future, he talks about like this part of dismantling hierarchies is dismantling gender, race, you know. And in his vision, you know, some of it's comical, you know, and the way he's doing it, it's meant to be funny, but he sort of says how some people may view that, you know, sort of as Black people as ruler, Black women as ruler, and think, oh my gosh, now I'm going to be oppressed. But he's like, he says something like, there's only going to be certain food served, or there's going to be certain music, you know. And so he's like, no. But the idea is that just like in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, you don't want to become the oppressor. So, you know, I just think that's really powerful to connect to Daughters of the Dust, to think about Bennett Caper's article.
You know, I wanted to just, like in my answer to the question, I wanted to just point to 3 different artists. I'm going to quickly show websites just so people can look at them later. So I'm going to share my screen. And I appreciate Omari for many things, but one is, you know, mentioning Hank Willis Thomas's work. Because these are people who inspire us and who are metabolizing, you know, life as we're living it. So another artist to look at in terms of Afrofuturism is David Huffman. He has a whole series of work where Black people, particularly from Oakland, go to space. And this is something he's been working on for over 10 years. They're now still in space, but there's been a whole narrative of going to space, sort of exploring it, and then essentially recreating Oakland in space. So here you can see like some car shenanigans, right? Like street racing going on. There's liquor stores, car washes. They rebuild the pyramids with basketballs. And this is right now, this particular painting is in the show Afrofuturism at the Oakland Museum. That's up right now, showing a funeral. And then Noah parting the Red Sea. So there's this tension between narrative and abstraction. And if you have the chance to recreate your culture, what will it look like, and what will be different, and what will be the same? Like, what will you keep? You know. And so there's a lot more to say about that. He's about to have a retrospective at the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco. Another artist who's important to think about in terms of Afrofuturism is the great Noah Purifoy. And you can go to his outdoor art museum in Joshua Tree at any time. There's no gates, there's no admission fees. And he's someone who was the first director of the Watts Tower Art Center. He was also the main visionary for the exhibition 66 Signs of Neon, where art was made from the melted neon signs from the Watts riots. And he moved in his 70s to Joshua Tree to make the work that he really felt like he hadn't been able to make. And it's incredible. It's made mostly from trash, or think of it all as junk art. There's references, to famous modernist artists and postmodernist artists, but then also his own vehicles for traveling to space, working with technology, and what we do as Black people historically with the leftovers, right, to create something from nothing. The other artist I need to mention is Colleen Smith. And I've just written an article, a chapter in a book, The Invention of the American Desert, which is about Afrofuturism, Funkadelic, Colleen Smith, and Noah Purifoy. And I think of all of these people as world makers who are pointing to alternative futures that we are living right now, or at least have the option of making part of our life today. So I just want to at least mention their names so people can think about looking at what they've been doing and thinking about Black utopias. And all of that future is so much tied, as we've been saying, particularly in the readings that we had. They are firmly rooted in the future because that's where our survival comes from. Sorry, I meant to say firmly rooted in the past because that's where our survival for the future comes from.
Do you mind if I ask, those three artists that you mentioned, I had never heard of those three, so I'm excited.
Okay, yeah, they're pretty exciting. Yeah, they are.
I'm wondering how do you think, and I always bring it back to my K-12 art teachers. How do you think a K-12 art teacher could utilize artists such as those in their own classrooms?
Yeah, there's so many things. I would say for K through 12, the process of art making is going to make the greatest impact. Maybe just kind of an overview of let's talk about imagination. Let's talk about if you could change things, what would it look like, And so here's someone named Noah Purifoy, and there was a race riot, right, in his neighborhood. And here's what he did with that. And here's what he created, and how can you do that? Bring some trash in, people have been doing this for years. Bring in some yogurt cups and some egg crates, and we're going to make something and put something, I think there's a process of making that can help students feel empowered to be creative and then understand the impulse of why, professional artists are doing it at the same time that they're learning about the artists and their circumstances of why they did this work. What do we learn, even walking into a space, which is invaluable with your students? And it's like, how do you feel when you're in this space? What are you drawn to and why? What looks familiar to you and what is strange? I mean, just that, and there's no learning outcome. And that's hard because, the states have learning outcomes for, all these different units for all the different grades. But there's something experiential that's important. And maybe when they learn about the Harlem Renaissance, which I think you have to in many states in the state curriculum, and you start talking about creativity, you can say, now let's look at what Black artists are doing now. And we're actually going to go to a museum, and then you're going to make something.
You can think about visual narratives too, because the Afrofuturism, like you said, is embedded in the past. So,
right.
Why was Noah, why was he taking these signs from a race riot that happened,
right.
60s, and then you can teach about the race riot, or if your state allows that. The state of Texas is trying to outlaw that, but that's just something that I love the way that you put that. I think you have the soul of a K-12 educator in you.
I do. You know what, Kathy? It's also because I do a lot of teacher training in California. Yeah, but I can't say I like kids, but I like some kids.
Some kids.
Met some kids I don't like as a kid and as an adult, but I have met some kids and I talk to them and they have so much to offer. And it's like, let's do this. Going on an adventure. Let's go to the desert. We're going to pack a lunch and we're going to make some stuff. And those are the things we remember from our childhood when we went on trips with our families, our friends, or you went to somebody else's house and you saw how they lived. And it was like, oh, really? Like, you guys have art in your house? Like you learn these alternative visions and then you sort of create yourself.
Yeah. And I love the idea with Wes. I'm bringing kind of connect. I tend to do the connect to what everyone says, but like how Wes talked about the U.S. as a design project. I mean, if you'd have just summed that thing up in a word, and then when Omari was talking about sort of how like bars, and I grew up in Detroit, I did most of my teaching in Detroit, and how there's bars on some of the stores you go into and the restaurants and things like that, and how redlining and how the idea of urban planning, and how like a city like Detroit, especially there was an area called the Black Bottom, but of course the freeways, once they started building freeways, they went through the Black areas, and that was part of urban planning that happened like 10 years prior, like Wes was saying. But I thought about an article, and you guys may be familiar with a guy named Le Paperson. That's his pseudonym. He's out of UC Berkeley. He's actually an Asian American gentleman. Last name is Wong, I believe, but his name is Paperson. But he wrote this article about cartography and sort of ideas of urban planning and how you ghettoize groups of people and you map groups of people and their place in certain areas purposely, and how part of it is, internalizing the oppressor, which comes from Frantz Fanon, of course, or Wretched of the Earth. But those ideas kind of all connected in the idea of the speculative and how we speculate how people are going to live and how we stay in that, is something too that is part of not thinking futuristically. We stay in the boxes that have been built for us, which I think happens many times. And then when he talks about Black pessimism, there's a Michael Dumas. I think he's out of UC Berkeley too. There's a lot happening in California where you are as well. Of course, Dr. Cooks, but he talks a lot about his ideas of anti-Blackness. We got that from Michael Dumas, who's a Black pessimist. But I just think that all of these ideas are coming together. I think this has been a powerful conversation. And I wonder, do you guys have any questions for each other? Because I know Lauren and I'm sure have more questions.
So one thing I've been considering, especially as a graphic designer and design professor, unfortunately, everything most design institutions teach typically lead you along this path of design for consumption. So you're designing something for this product, or you're designing something for this agency or this client in order to keep them in the black versus being in the red. And a lot of times the things that we design end up being luxury-based items that may or may not make their way into our communities. I think about that as a designer, especially considering that in a lot of ways we perpetuate a lot of the language that happens around us. We simply reflect that language that's either spoken or written. And while considering those things, I also think of the fact that a lot of American, backtracking before I say that, while also perpetuating language, I realize that as Black people, we're being the in-betweeners of this nation, we're consistently trying to carve out our own identities and to exist, within or beyond the parameters they give us as a subculture. A book I've been reading recently called Unthinking Eurocentrism talks about how a part of Eurocentric thinking is appropriating aspects of cultures that belong to other people, claiming them as their own without giving adequate credit to the people who influenced it. And much of American culture is influenced by Black subculture experiences, whether it's social dances like the cakewalk, whether you want to talk about the people that are profiting off of Black social dances on TikTok, forms of Black expression and aesthetics that, are influencing fashion, things of that nature. We happen to be a huge influencer of American culture. Even if we think about food, like some of the most popular foods within America are foods that were derivative of slave cooks. The oldest American trademark being the Aunt Jemima brand is a relic of the lost cause rhetoric. So with all of that being said, the question that I ask is, as a group of people that are attempting to push, within our respective fields, and again, design within itself being a result of colonialism. The Bauhaus movement happened at a time period where designers and artists were getting together and attempting to reestablish Germany post the loss of World War I. Germany being a colonizing party, a lot of art history and art museums are based on theft and colonization of people from other cultures and relics from these other cultures that are still being held to this day. How do we as historians and practitioners protect ourselves and our assets? How do we position ourselves in the future as people of value, especially within a society and nation that has perpetually told us that we don't have value, but then take the things that we do in order to make the Elvises of the world and all of these other, people that appropriate whom we are. So yeah, that's the question I would ask.
So like around protection and maybe even, I think that I'm always like, I have always these conflicting thoughts, but I'm like, on one end, like, I feel like it's liberating for me personally. It's liberating to make when I'm not thinking about protecting what I make, right? So when I'm not thinking about copyright, when I'm not thinking about covering my ass, like I'm the freest in my creation, which may not be the answer to protection, but also I'm like the laws that protect us, such as copyright and like all these things, are still based in property and like these ideals that like don't benefit us any. Like once we get going to like wormholes of like copyright, and not saying that this is what it all boils down to, but these things, then like these are actually not our systems. We don't even have control over wielding power of who owns copyright or not when it comes down in court. You know what I mean? So like I'm always like thinking about that. It's like, so why would I even bother? And to me, like, and then there's also this personal thing where it's just like, I don't actually think like there's definitely like the in between us, like in between this, as you mentioned, as like people. And I'm like, without question, US culture is Black culture. Like Black culture is US culture. Like there's no question about that. And like, I don't even know, there would be a major void of culture if you did not say in this region, on this land, post European colonization, right? And so like also just like realizing like what was borrowed by indigenous thought too. Like we can't ignore those ideas of indigeneity in like the ways of our thinking and philosophies and all of that and the convergence of those things. But and then I'm also like thinking about this radical thought, right? Like leave. Like we talking about going to space, can we leave this country? You know what I mean? Like that's a thought about protection, but also like doing like obviously in some ways that's a dismissive way to say things. So I mean it with all like I mean it genuinely, but also like that would mean entering another place very responsibly and respectfully and like in a way that like that is not replicating colonization, right? And what does that even mean? But I think being able to vision that as science fiction and I think once again I'm going back to Octavia Butler, but I think like that's what she was visioning, like entering and exiting in a way that I think it was not borrowed, but also taken on and moved by like urban bush women in the way that they move through the world, and thinking about entering and exiting places. And so I'm like, the US is not it for us to have any of those thoughts or any of those protections or any of those freedoms. And I think there's gonna have to be a realization because you have Elon Musk being like, the earth is not it for him to have his supreme rule over whatever he wants to have supreme rule over. And that's really what's in contention right now. I
feel like, the whole history of art is appropriation and we don't have any protections, I feel like maybe one of the ways, this isn't a complete answer, but open sourcing, just making things to be shared is one approach to it, even though everybody needs to get paid and recognized for their work at the same time, But, it's like when Wes is talking about proprietary issues and property, like open sourcing is a way to just criticize that and just say, I'm making this for an audience that's a different audience than the copyright system, So it's difficult. I don't think there's any one answer. And Black people need to get paid for their labor. Like, that is my whole philosophy for collaboration. So I think one thing I'm encouraged by is that we have a number of artists, particularly when they get, it's not always, but sometimes when they get the MacArthur, Genius Fellowships and they get all this money, it has become a tradition for Black artists to establish something with that money. So that we see that happening with Titus Kaphar and the development of Next Haven. We see that with Kehinde Wiley and Black Rock in Senegal. We see that with the development of Art and Practice, a gallery, and an after-school foster care program that Mark Bradford did here in Leimert Park in LA. So I think there's some kind of shift in power and maybe an idea of proprietary systems when we get to own our own shit, and to make it a priority for Black people and people of color, right? Not to the exclusion of all white people, especially those who are, not cisgender and on a greater spectrum of sexuality, because they are also part of that. But they are not the priority, and they have to be willing to not be the center of attention. That these systems in these particular places were not built for them. They can still learn, and they can even contribute, right? But it's about having enough capital and funding, really in a capitalist nation, to be able to say, I'm now going to make my own thing. And I'm going to design it to allow other people to make this part of their development. So that's, we talk about these moments of like Black creativity and explosion. We're like, especially right now in the art world, like it's very, the Negro is definitely in vogue, right? So, and the portal is closing. So like, get your idea through, get those applications in, because, time's up. And so, but we also think about, history repeats itself. Yes, but not completely. Like there's always some kind of modification that allows it to sort of reemerge and look a little bit different. And I think one of the things that makes this moment different from previous Vogue moments is capital. Even though it's in a very extreme minority of people, what those people have the ability to do with it, I think, can make seismic shifts. And the way that we support and speak about what they do, it's really, that's part of the inspiration. How do you keep going on? And it's like, wow, we have more opportunities at the same time that the hatred against us is still persistent.
I think that's everything that all of you have said, I think is spot on. And I think I tend to think in similar ways about protecting can in some ways be literally protecting, protecting by speaking up, when things are wrong, and taking the risk of speaking up, right? Because sometimes when we speak up, we can be kind of at risk. But I think for me, it definitely, it's about ethics, like a cultural ethics, a cultural ethics where you acknowledge, you're aware of how we move in the world is different. And so therefore we have to do different things, and then, how do you give back? Kind of like what Bridget was saying, tying things back to our community and staying connected to our community. I feel like that is something that is what I'm continuing to learn is the most important thing, because sometimes, how our system works is like, as you move up, like you're supposed to kind of leave, right? Or like leave everybody behind. And one of the things that I keep thinking through, and it's actually my students that kind of helped me to think even more so in this way, is like, what are we doing with our community, as we start to, find these opportunities to create, create space, create place. How are we tying it back in and building in these mechanisms of support for others? And I do feel like there's some protection in that. But I feel like what I keep running into is protection is like literally to protect, people, like literally protecting people that I can see are being, that are more vulnerable than maybe we're all vulnerable. We're all vulnerable. But as you start to get access or power or leverage or whatever, recognizing that other people also need that leverage and power and support too, and not being afraid to risk that, on behalf of other people that are more vulnerable, So yes, I just feel like it's such a huge journey that we all have to be on, in this creative field.
I just wanted to say, tie into Omari's idea of the in-betweeners and how we're Black people in America are like a uniquely American invention, And in Bennett Caper's article, I know I keep going back to it, he quotes another person, I think his name is Norris, and he says, we are the transatlantic children of the mother continent. So I thought about that as the idea of in-betweeners, and then I thought about this whole conversation, us being here in this virtual space, the whole thing is palimpsest. The whole thing is we're writing, erasing, replacing, and then with the traces of what's left behind. So I just think that this has been a powerful experience, and I have a ton of notes, and I hope you guys got to see what Bridget put in the chat. Bridget, do you mind just sharing that? Because I know the audience wants to see what that is.
I will share that. So I just was, first of all, I'm going to follow up with Omari and Wes, because I have a project about design and book covers of Black revolutionary fiction, and I really want to talk to both of you about that. And so I was thinking about design projects, and so I'm just going to type this in and then share my screen for like 5 seconds so that you can see this on the recording. But I just wanted people to know about this font that was developed by Forrest Young and Jeremy Mickle. They were challenged to do this by Titus Kaphar and Reginald Dwayne Betts, who just won a MacArthur Fellowship this week. And Titus had already won one. And this is a font that now is known as the social justice font. It's open source. Anyone can download it. I write most of the things I create with it. And it is a font that was designed with ideas of power and exclusion in it, in terms of wanting to create a font that addressed the way that governmental systems, even in terms of legal texts, legal briefs, can hide one's identity. We think about redacting information in classified or recently unclassified materials, the way that we can use text, language, and design to spotlight or hide or change the way that information appears. And it was a very thoughtful, incredibly well designed project. And so there's a lot of information about this here. And again, when you get down to the bottom of the website, you can agree to make history and then download it. And if you go to the blackindex.art website, we had a publication launch for the catalog for the show, and so many people were involved who spoke. Two of them were the designers, Young and Mickle, who, to hear them speak about the research they did to create the font is just fascinating. I watched it maybe 6 times with different people. They even show how, now that they made it available to anyone, how it's been used in all kinds of different spaces. You don't have to get their permission to use it. And so how amazing to see what kinds of design projects have included redaction as part of the layering of their expression. So I just want to recommend both of these sites to everybody.
I'm over here getting my life because you guys are networking and you're going to be a new family, Oh my goodness, I'm sorry. Were you going to say something, Wes? I apologize.
No, Kathy, I wanted to give you a plug on a book, going back to a previous conversation with Omari. We were bringing up like this idea of like the built environment. And I would say this is like a prototypical book that didn't make its way into circulation, but was influential in a lot of ways, written by Gloria House, called Tower and Dungeon. And Gloria House goes by Aneb Kashigi, but the book is out of print. But she was one of the first scholars to quote Foucault in talking about like the built environment and quoting like ideas of the panopticon and things like that.
Yes.
But it is based around Detroit. So she creates like this geographic gestalt between the Renaissance Center, right as it was being built, and the Jackson State Prison, when it was the largest prison in the country. And so she talks about how the built environment, both of these, the high rise and the prison, are both part of the same lineage of representing and protecting capital. And so she's thinking about like how the built environment affects, and she's talking about gentrification in the early 80s, and as it was happening in the Cass Corridor, and like through like that whole thing. So it's like it's out of print. We're working on actually repressing the book, but she's talking about like design, space, and architecture, and the encoded like practice of architecture to disorient, to ground, to do all of these things that are not necessarily present. And so, like, as an example, she brings up the Renaissance Center, the inside of it, and how it's disorienting. And, if you've been in there, you realize like it is, but like how it was purposefully so, and the intention. And so she goes and tries to track down like the architect and like try to figure out what is like the process in like these methods, and then how it also affects people's like psyche, physical and psychological, like being in prisons and all that. So she was really early on like some of that conversation, and this was like for her Ph.D. at the University of Michigan for philosophy. So, and she was, and so she was really like, what's funny is like she would talk about like at the University of Michigan in their philosophy like program, and how much pushback she would get for quoting Foucault. They're like, who is this guy? And like, from like that point, like when she was doing this in the 70s and early 80s.
Okay. Thank you so much. Did anybody have any parting words? Anybody want to share any of their work? Any website or anything before we close out?
I don't have any work to share currently. I guess be on the lookout. I just submitted the manuscript for my book, Pot Not Yet Melted. So I'm waiting to hear back from the publisher. Also, the State of Black Design will be hosting our third event in March 4th through 6th, a Friday, Saturday, and Sunday events. The theme for it is called Family Reunion. It's a play on words because it's going to be a hybrid event, and also deals with the idea of intersectionality. So would love to see you guys there as well. And, I'm really interested in this conversation that we're having here being continued on a panel there as well, too.
Is there a website where the audience will be able to find do they just type in the Black Design Experience or Black Design Conference?
The State of Black Design Conference, yeah. So there's the event website has not been updated as of yet. We're going to be making the announcement soon.
let's see, I'm curating an event in Richmond called Inlight. I'm co-curating it with a couple really talented curators, one Park Myers and then Tiffany Barber also. And so, yeah, it'll be really interesting. It's an outside light festival that we've, I think, done a lot of work for the past 3 years, like bringing this to like being really hard hitting work that is not just based in spectacle, but is in transferring that. And then, you know, I think 2 more plugs is the Design Justice Network, which is a lot of like deep work going on that is a lot of like slow and intentional work towards like this idea of justice through creativity and design. Really a lot of talented designers part of the network, and a lot of like intersection going on with design as protest, also like intersectional with you know, AI justice and things like that. And then last plug is my collective Complex Movement, which I feel like it is, we made a performance called Beware the Dandelions. And I think it's this convergence of like future thinking, interdisciplinary work, uncategorizable or work that you can't categorize, but I think is forward leaning and pushing and uses the traditions of like Octavia Butler, Jameson, and then also borrowing from people within our community to turn into characters for science fiction. And it's a simulation for like justice and movement building, set by our elders, such as like Grace Lee Boggs, Jimmy Boggs, and people like that, like deeply rooted in Detroit radical traditions.
I'm talking about.
Yeah.
All about the D, Detroit.
Yeah.
And you may not know that Lauren just did a similar show, a light show, with City of Fort Worth. Lauren, did you want to share that with our audience before we close out?
Yeah. So we did an exhibition in connection with the City of Fort Worth and the Arts Council of Fort Worth. Did a show of new media artworks, all on the exterior of our Will Rogers Auditorium, that whole corridor. And there's a new Pioneer Tower that featured 2 international artists. And so I curated the exhibition that surrounded the tower, and highlighted a diverse collection of artists within the North Texas region. And it was called New Stories, New Futures. And each of the artists were talking about conversations about community. You know, in Fort Worth, we've had a rough, we've had some rough times. You know, national level, you know, news. I mean, I think just North Texas in general, we've had some really rough experiences of seeing our brothers and sisters, you know, killed. And so in a lot of ways, wanting to bring attention, the creative community wanting to bring attention to that and not push those things under the rug. So New Stories, New Futures was all about artists bringing forth their stories, you know, and the various different like corners of the community that you wouldn't necessarily hear stories necessarily like coming to the surface. Like for when we talk about art and community, artists were like, no, this is what I really want to talk about. And so it was really exciting to see, you know, these were all site-specific works too. So they were like literally created or reimagined for this new type of making. Some of them are painters, traditional painters, and did new media, video projections. So it was really exciting to kind of see artists challenging themselves to think differently about their community and about what they could say to their communities. So it was powerful to see. the progression and the journey of each artist, and just to be a part of that. So yeah, you can check out New Stories, New Futures, the website, and I know that there's some documentation of the show coming. So
congratulations to Lauren. Congratulations to all of you. And I'm just going to plug my article that just came out. The audience is going to be watching. It's a co-authored piece called Black Hair, Black Hair as Metaphor, explored through art space research and dual ethnography is the name of it. And I have some art shows coming up too. But anyway, so this has been a glorious, glorious time. Thank you all for staying past once we get talking and vibing, kind of a dope conversation always comes out. So thank you all for your time. And I'm sure Lauren is going to thank you all as well. And thank you to the audience, our future audience. And thank you to Peter Highland, who was behind the camera, and the editing team. And again, the Onstate Institute and the University of North Texas College of Visual Art and Design.
I just want to thank all of our panelists, Omari, Bridget, and Wes. We're just so appreciative for your time and you sharing your work with us and with our audience, with all the people who will watch this in the future. When Dr. Brown and I, when Kathy and I, when we created this, we were thinking about the future of the state of art and design and how could we make a contribution that could extend into the future. And that was why we called it the 2044 series, because we really want to, we want our work as Black faculty, as Black creatives, we want it to make an impact that could extend into the future. And we invited you all because you're doing that stuff too. So we're excited and thankful that you joined us today.
Thank you.
Thank you guys,
everybody.
Thank you, guys.
It's nice to meet everybody.
Yeah.
We'll be in touch.
Let's keep in touch, everybody.
Definitely.